Welcome.
Good morning. Yeah, thanks. Welcome. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jean Richardson, and I have the privilege of being the director of Kirkridge Retreat and Study Center. And I have also the privilege of working with Justine Johnson, who has done more than just be the tech person in these last months. So I just want to share with you that this series has been a long time in the making. And behind all good work, there's an amazing team that's worked together. Pardon me? There's been an amazing.
Come on board for me as a president. She doesn't know.
Are people having trouble hearing me? Are we okay?
We're good.
Okay. All right. So we've had an amazing team that's worked together crafting this, and then COVID came, and then we had to recraft and recraft again. So before we begin, I just want to shout out to the team: Michael Adey, Katie and Max Schaefer, Dominic Betito, and Justine, and last but not least, Erin Swenson, who's going to be starting us off today with this program, Transgender 101, Beyond Pink and Blue. The whole program started with the dream of Kirkridge serving families with gender diverse children. As many of you know, since 1978, Kirkridge has welcomed LGBTQ individuals to the sacred mountain, attempting to create a safe place and heal the divide between our lives and our faith. This series, The Welcoming Home, is just one more step on that journey. It's also important to thank the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation for their support and all the work they do in bridging the gap between faith and individuals divided from their faith communities because of who they are. Justine has given us any last minute guidance, and so we are grateful for that. Please feel free to use the chat room. And Erin, I am so delighted to welcome you to lead us as we kick off this programming, and for you to not only tell us your story, but to guide us in Transgender 101.
Thank you so much, Jean, and what an honor it is. I mean, Jean is right. This has been an incredible team, and I just feel thankful and honored to be first at bat here for this particular series of presentations, and hope everyone comes to all of them and makes use of them. They're going to be great. Thank you, everyone, especially Justine and Jean and Kirkridge. And of course, my mentor and brother, Michael Adey. So welcome to Trans 101, Beyond Pink and Blue. My guess is that we have quite a number of people, and you're probably all over the map in terms of how much you know and what you have what you've experienced about transgender. Hopefully, in our very diverse world, you've had a chance by now to meet transgender people and to come to understand who they are and what they're like. So we're going to give you a few words and maybe concepts to help you understand a little more deeply the reality that they experience. So that's kind of what we're about. And we'll start out, of course, with Happy Juneteenth weekend. I found this a picture of a Texas historical marker because Juneteenth, of course, started in Texas. I first encountered it when I was in Houston I was preaching at a Presbyterian church in Houston on Sunday morning, and I got there early, and I was going around with the pastor visiting the city, and it happened to be the 19th of June and a Saturday, and the streets were absolutely packed with people. And so I said, what in the world is this? And she said, it's Juneteenth. And you know what? That was my introduction. And I hope with what we're doing these days that everyone knows. And I hope you're with me. Let's make it a national holiday. Trans 101, here we go. This is where many people start. We wonder what gender is. It's a word that doesn't appear too often in literature in the past. except related to nouns, because nouns and names can have gender, and that's where we mostly learn the term. So what does that mean, and how does it change it to talk about gender identity? Is it the same thing as sex? And are transgender and gender non-conforming people gay? That's the old question, and I have to deal with it, and I apologize to you if you know all about that, but it's very important to cover. And it's important to understand the difference between the word transgender and the term gender non-conforming. You'll hear those words used sometimes interchangeably these days. And while probably the biggest difference has got to do with age, people who are older tend to use the term transgender, and gender non-conforming tends to be a younger person's term. They both are important, and we need to know what both of them are. The question that I get very often is, isn't it true that you can have only XX or XY chromosomes and they cannot be changed? There's no way to change what your chromosomes are, at least now. And so, you know, doesn't that mean that you really can't change from being a man to a woman? The answer to that question is probably yes and probably no. So there are, that's an interesting question. And of course, the thing, especially that parents worry about the most when they have trans kids is, isn't this all just a fad, you know, like hula hoops? Aren't you afraid that one day you'll be sorry that you did this? Well, just so you know, I did this 25 years ago, this last spring. And I can tell you without reservation that in all those 25 years, I have never regretted it, nor has my family. And in fact, even my presbytery has not regretted it, although they fought me tooth and nail 25 years ago about it. A little vocabulary. Transgender is a fairly new term. It's only been around for maybe 20 or 25 years. It's used for people who vary from gender norms. It's kind of an umbrella term that covers a lot of things. Many gender non-conforming people consider themselves also to be transgender. And I sometimes use, because I'm not really good at typing, so sometimes I use TGNC, transgender non-conforming. I kind of put them together to make the acronym to be inclusive so that I don't type. So when you see that, you know what that means. The word gender variant is also a term that you're going to see a fair amount these days. It's a term that's inclusive to express transgender non-conforming people really in history. It's a historical term that is used because the term transgender, for instance, was not known or even suspected during Hebrew or Greek Testament times. We don't use them when we talk about people like Joseph in the Old Testament. There's some very good scholarship these days about Joseph's coat of many colors and his relationship with his father and his brothers that indicate that he could probably be seen as gender variant. We would never use the word transgender related to Joseph, but we would see him as gender variant to help us look at how inclusive some of the Hebrew and Greek scriptures can be. We'll have more words, but we'll pick them up as we go. I want you to know, however, that I am only one person. Behind me it is a group of, in this country, 1.5 million people who are transgender or gender nonconforming. And there are 1.5 different diverse ideas about what transgender really means. So please don't think because you've got these words from me that you have the last word on anyone. Okay, we'll start with history, because it helps us to understand. If we place some of this in context, it will help us to put together this and understand where it is today. As I'm sure that all of you recall from your anthropology class, people started standing upright and being called people about 6 million years ago. And that it wasn't until about 60,000 5,000 years ago. That is 5.94 million years ago. Well, 5.9 million years is what it took for people to begin using tools. People think that they probably used the first tools to fish with. We've been developing that ever since, and our tools have become quite sophisticated. But I'd like you to look at that number, the 5.94 million years that it took us to get from just standing upright to starting to catch fish, to help us understand that sometimes things take a long time. And gender is one of those things. Gender's been with us actually from the very beginning. And if we look at gender through the lens of history, we'll get a better idea of what its meaning is. So I put together this brief little timeline, which I should, there, oh, good. There, I can do it that way. Here, okay. Excuse me, I just had to get rid of my timeline because it was bothering me. This timeline only covers from about 550 BCE to the present. So we're only talking about 2,500 years. Starts at Isaiah, and these are some of the earliest writings by humans. Isaiah was not too long after humans started sharing things in writing. And Isaiah, in Isaiah 56, Isaiah puts into the mouth of God the honor of eunuchs as better than sons and daughters, people deserving of a place of honor and a monument in the house of God. And so we get introduced to the beginning of gender variant people very early. We knew that they probably existed before. Jesus reflected that same kind of teaching in his life. I believe it was Matthew 6. Some of you can probably correct me about that. That Jesus' teaching about marriage includes a very interesting paragraph where he talks about people who've made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of God, people who have been made eunuchs by other people, and people who've been eunuchs since birth, indicating that there's an awareness that there were babies born whose anatomical sex didn't match the male or female thing. Back in these early days, I have to thank Michael for the reflection on the period. Gender variant people were either revered or reviled. It was the age of shamans and where shamanistic practice got its start. Please note that it still exists today, so we're not talking about a dead religion. But shamanism included a very strong flavor of gender variance. Shamans were considered to be very often both male and female to reflect their universality and inclusion, or perhaps even neither. Their healing powers were to come mystically from the combination or the absence of the two, and they were revered as healers and wise people in their communities. Of course, the other side is they're reviled. The eunuchs. The reason that passage is in eunuchs in Isaiah in 550 was because the Jews were clear that eunuchs were not allowed to be in the holy spaces, and they were not considered to be completely human, and they were deeply reviled. They weren't ever considered to be normal folks like you and me walking down the street. They were either revered or reviled, and never anything else. Joan of Arc in the 1400s was burned at the stake. Many people believe that was because of her religious beliefs, but it was simply because in prison she insisted on wearing the soldier's uniform that she was famous for, which of course in her day was specifically and restricted to men. It was male clothing, and she insisted on wearing it in the prison. They warned her several times to stop. She didn't. She refused and subsequently was burned at the stake. It was sort of the rise of gender becoming a political force in culture, and I cited that 600 years ago. A little closer to now, Sarah Emma Edmonds was the only woman admitted to the Grand Army of the Republic because she served in the Union Army in the Civil War as a man. she wasn't alone. Hundreds of other stories of women who cut their hair, changed their clothes, bound their breasts, and moved sometimes with their husbands and lovers, sometimes on their own into the ranks of soldiers to fight for things they believed in. And we can probably cite that way farther back than 1860. But that to me is one of the most grand examples, because she was literally honored as a male soldier and was a woman. In 1930 was what was considered to be the first modern sex change surgery. It occurred in, I'm guessing, I better not say. There's a famous movie, fairly recent, about Lily Elbe. And I know that someone will put that on I meant to look that up. Someone put that on the chat thing so that we all have that. It's the story of how Einar Wegener, a Danish painter, actually went through surgery to become the first modern transsexual. Christine Jorgensen was the most famous in 1952, and she was the one that really put the word transsexual into everyday language. Surprisingly, it wasn't until the 1960s and Robert Stoller and John Money that the word gender identity began to appear. This was the first time in history that we began to understand that gender was something that was not simply attached to what our genitals looked like. Throughout all of that history before then, it was simply presumed that if you had male anatomy, you were a man, and if you had female anatomy, you were a woman. All of these exceptions to the rule going way back to 550 BCE were kind of ignored or considered to be exceptions, or kind of sort of passed off as something that wasn't worth thinking about. Of course, until Christine came on the scene and we began to understand that there were many, many, many more people than just a few. And we began to understand, and Robert Stoller and John Money are to be honored for their helping us to begin to understand that gender identity is something different from our anatomy. John had a kind of a different view, which got him into hot water. He thought that gender identity was a blank tablet in the new baby, and that you could raise a child to have a male gender identity or a female gender identity simply by raising them carefully and rearing them as the right gender. He, of course, was dead wrong. We learned he learned through painful lessons that in fact gender identity is probably something that we are in some ways born with, and it becomes irreversibly entrenched by the time, probably by the time we walk, and certainly by the time we become social. And I put in 2020 because it was just last week that the Supreme Court of the United States finally took the very unexpected and very wonderful step of including transgender among gay, lesbian, and bisexual people, as well as the other plus people in the acronym, that we are protected for the purposes of employment, which is a wonderful thing. Oops. So, while gender identity is a new word, it really does reflect a way of being in the world that goes way, way back. I've found a picture of a Korean shaman just to show you that the ancient shamanistic ideas weren't just part of European culture, but also a part of Asian and most especially African culture. So now we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty of 101. First of all, to accept the idea that there's really no binary. That's the first challenge, is what we are to do here, is to accept the idea that there really is no binary either or about human sexuality. That gender variance is really a very old idea. If you're like me, you were raised from a child to believe that boys and girls are different from each other in just about every way, only simply signified by the reality of their genitals. The truth is, the genitals are not even binary, and human beings have much more sexual variety than just plain male and female. So let's begin with sex. And here is our guide for Transgender 101, the genderbread person. One of my friends that I've known for a long time. And the genderbread person starts out by showing us that we're going to think about sex. And so the genderbread person shows sex as in the genitals. Of course, we all know that anatomical and biological sex is expressed throughout the body in primary and secondary sex characteristics and suffuses the brain and probably every cell of our bodies. So please excuse this, but we're just going to use this as a model to think about sex as a discrete part of our being. And you'll notice at the bottom we have a continuum. The continuum has arrows pointing in both directions with male and female. The arrows mean that we haven't really reached, we don't really know what the ideal male and female are. Probably the ideal male and female is something that will change over time and continues to develop. But for right now, we can think of male and female as two ends of a continuum, and that all people exist somewhere in between. Some of us are completely male, some completely female. Some of us are not on the continuum at each end, but somewhere maybe near each end or maybe closer to the middle. The middle is tick marked with something called intersex, which is kind of an interesting thing. I hope you've heard of that. We're going to look at that in a minute. The idea that biological sex is not binary is new for some people. What we're going to do, instead of going through this, I happen to have a special interest in the biology of sexual differentiation. And it is a complicated, difficult process that involves many steps in the development of the human being from conception through years after conception. And there are many influences on its development. So we can't go into those, but I just wanted to start at the very beginning when the egg and the sperm are united and fertilized. And as you probably remember, each parent, the father and the mother, contributes 1/2 of the sex determining chromosome to the new baby. Men have XY chromosomes. It's the 23rd pair that is the sex determining pair. And women usually have XX chromosomes as that pair. So each parent contributes one of those two. So we only have 4 combinations. We have a father who has XY and a mother who has XX. Each one of them contributes one of those. And you can see that at least theoretically, it looks like there should be an equal number of boys and girls. Actually, more boys are born than girls are born. That's an interesting story in itself, but it's beyond the scope of this topic. You might want to pick it up in the Trans and the Family class next month. But notice that the person who actually determines the gender of the new baby is good old dad. Mom can only contribute an X and thereby can only be part ways responsible, but has no contribution that will help a baby develop into a boy or a girl. Dad has that. That's only one way that chromosomes can happen. And I just wanted to show you a chart of some of the other ways, and this is just some of them. The normal karyotype is 46XY or 46XX, XY for a girl, XY for a boy, XX for a girl. Turner syndrome is 45X. It means that for some reason, the second chromosome didn't come through in conception for some reason, and the child has sex-determining chromosomes with X. Sometimes you'll see it as X0, but it's more often just called X because it would normally be XX. It's just X. Turner syndrome people are typically female because there's no Y chromosome, which is the place where the influence toward masculinity comes from. And there are quite a number of Turner syndrome people. Klinefelter is down there a little bit further. It's kind of a related syndrome because it's sort of the opposite. Instead of getting no second chromosome, Klinefelter people get a whole pair get an extra one, and the extra one is an X, so it comes out as XXY. Klinefelter syndrome folks, typically because they have a Y chromosome, develop as males. There are not as many of them. Turner syndrome is much more common. I'd like to also mention mosaicism because it is actually, to me, an example of how marvelously adaptive we human beings really can be. Very rarely in the womb, when there are twins born, or twins conceived in the womb, we have two zygotes that are floating around, getting ready to attach to the mother's uterus. And something we don't quite know what happens, and one of the zygotes becomes absorbed by the other. What that means is the genetic material of one of the twins becomes absorbed into the gene structure of the other twin. And what develops is actually one person who has two complete lists of chromosomes. So it's almost like two people in one person. And in fact, it's possible to have mosaicism and have chromosomes that are both male and some that are female. And it's possible with mosaicism to also be born with the sex sex organs of both male and female. And this is only one of the ways that biological sex can be complicated. There are hundreds more. I want to say this to sort of drive home the idea to you that male and female are not binary separate things. We use the term intersex to describe all the people whose biological sex characteristics are not stereotypically male or female. That could mean someone who is born with a sexual member that is too large to be a girl and too small to be a boy. That could be someone who's born whose genitals look completely female and whose chromosomes are completely male. There are all kinds of patterns, and it's very, very important to understand that. There are other terms that you might hear. Disorder of sexual development is used. It's a medical term, and people who are intersex don't like it because of that disorder word in there, and I tend to agree with them. Hermaphroditism is also the archaic term for this, which you may have heard in the past. It is archaic and not used. So back to our gender-bent person. Take a sec. Take a look at this continuum and put a little tick mark on there where you think you are biologically. Now, this may sound like a shocking question. You might have just always assumed that you were a man or a woman. But think about it for a few minutes. Are there parts about your secondary or primary sex organs that haven't ever seemed quite perfectly the way that you thought that they should be if you were fully male or female? If you are, you're among a large number of other people. Some of the things that happen are women who have little or no breast development, or have a clitoris that's larger than other women's, or a man who has his urethra exit his body at a place other than the end of the penis, sometimes even in the perineum, which is the place where women have their urethra. So you have a male who has to sit down to pee. And there are a lot of people like that, and we have to start recognizing that they exist among us. So you may want to take the risk and put yourself in there, but give yourself a little tick mark. And let's move on to gender identity. That is the internally held sense of being yourself, whether that is male, female, or some other sense. So as you can see, this is completely different than biological sex. It has nothing to do with your biology. It has nothing to do with how tall you are, or what your genitals look like, or what your hair is like, or how old you are. It doesn't matter about any of that. This is an internally held sense of being yourself. So if you feel like a man and you are a man, that's great. If you feel like a woman and you are a woman, that's great. You are like most people. We also call you cisgender, but we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. For other people, it's very important to understand that gender identity does not really correspond with their biologically determined sex. You could perhaps suspect this if you are a woman who does not really like to wear makeup, because that's, you know, what women are expected to do. You might wear it. You might wear it because it's expected of you, or the folks at work require it, but you don't like wearing it. Or perhaps you're a man who enjoys silky pajamas, or even maybe a nice silky nightgown. You might enjoy that, but you don't do it because you don't want to upset your spouse or your partner, or you're afraid someone will see you through the window, and there might be gossip about you, and it might cost you more than it's worth. Perhaps you're a teenage girl who always felt herself to be a boy on the inside. You would be surprised how often that happens these days. Or a boy who likes to be the mom when playing house and does that consistently over the years. Or a girl who hates to wear dresses and likes rough play. All of these things can be either transient or permanent, and they are completely different than sexual orientation. So a person is TGNC when they determine their internally held identity and gender to be different from their sex. That's how you join the TGNC community. It is possible to be transgender and determine that you will not do any kind of a transition. There are many TGNC, transgender people, who have never changed their sex, who have never taken hormones, who have never worn clothes other than the ones that are characteristic of their assigned gender. But they hold within their hearts a sincere feeling and desire for the opposite or a different gender. I was one of those people for most of my life. It is not a mental illness. Gender identity disorder was thankfully removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in 2013, just like homosexuality was about 10 years before. There is a diagnosis that you will find in there called gender dysphoria. It literally means gender discomfort. And that's the distress that comes from being transgender in a society that does not value transgender people. Please note, gender dysphoria is not a sense of discomfort about my gender at all. It is a sense of discomfort about how other people think or respond to my gender expression. So take a moment. Reflect on your own internal sense of who you are. Are there things about your gender that make you feel uncomfortable or have in the past? If you feel safe, put a tick mark on the gender identity line of our gender bled. I'm going to have to find a good abbreviation for that. For our gender-bred person to reflect where you think you are now. And remember, it's only what you think for now and could easily be different in a day, a week, a month, or even years. Here it is to help you out. I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to complete that. You'll notice that we have another anticipated term between male and female, and that is genderqueer. The placement of that is about the best definition that I can give you. Nobody really knows what genderqueer means. You will get 10 different definitions from 10 different people. Suffice it to say, genderqueer is a person whose gender identity is queer. And moving on to sexual orientation. This is our third bar. We included in here, and you notice that where sex was shown on our genderbread person in the genital area, and gender being more of a function of our intellect was located in the head. Orientation is located in the heart. This has got to do with affection. So you should have a pretty good idea. Most people now these days know what that is. I fall in love with the other who attracts my sexual affection, attention. Sexual orientation is about who I fall in love with. It is the other. It is the person who attracts my sexual or affectionate attention. It is described by being lesbian, gay, or bisexual. Is someone talking to me? I'm sorry. Okay. It is described by lesbian, gay, and bisexual, but not the transgender, not the T. Gender, on the other hand, is about who I am on the inside. Although related, it's very different from sexual orientation. And then, of course, what happens is it becomes complicated. When sexual orientation is considered to be a function of only biological sex, it stays clear. But when we start thinking about sexual orientation related to gender identity, then it becomes less clear. I mean, for instance, you know, I'm a biological male, at least I was. I was in a very loving relationship, still am, with a woman who is a female. If I marry her, is that a heterosexual or a lesbian relationship, since my gender identity has always been and currently is female? What do you think? Are you to say, or who is to say that? My opinion is that people get to say, to define themselves if they want to. I just included this slide just so you can see who we're talking about. The LGB part of the spectrum is about 13.5 million people. Transgender, I didn't include transgender in that. It's another 1.5 million people, or about 0.43% of the general population. I also included the plus. The plus means, you know, LGBT, intersex, QIAA+, all those things. So those are there. And that includes then cis and hetero at 313.4. So for those who wonder what cis is, this is an abbreviation for cisgender. That's the word, denoting or relating to a person whose sense of personal identity and gender corresponds with their birth sex. Cis comes from the Latin word cis, meaning this side of. It really means staying on the same side of the gender spectrum that you were born on. And the fact is, most of the people who are attending this seminar are cisgender. There are a few of us, including me, who are not. Okay, take another moment. Place a little tick mark in there, if you would like. You notice that the orientation says male and female instead of gay and straight. And that's to help you so that you don't have to identify as gay or straight. You can identify in the way that in the orientation of the gender you are attracted to. So if you're a heterosexual male, you might be more on the side that points to female. And if you're a heterosexual female, the other side. Bisexual, of course, is in the center. Okay, now we come to the money. This is the money round. Gender expression. While we've added our fourth continuum at the bottom, notice it's masculine and feminine now, not male and female, and the center is androgynous. Also notice that our gingerbread person has now moved outside themselves. Our gingerbread person is now giving us, moving to expression, because gender expression is all social. It's the myriad ways that our gender is expressed socially. What are some of those? Clothing, that's probably one of the most powerful. Grooming, with whom we choose to partner. Patterns of speech. I saw all of those and I saw an opportunity to create a little rhyme. What we wear, how we comb our hair, with whom we pair, and how we share. Patterns of speech include many things: diction, word choice, patterns of verbal interaction, and lots more. Gender expression is a person's behavior, manners, and interests and appearance that are associated with gender in a particular social context, so they are culturally determined, specifically with the categories of femininity or masculinity. This also includes gender roles. The mind-blowing reality is almost 100% of gender expression is learned. I'll repeat that. Almost 100% of gender expression is learned. I'm sure there's one or two people I've upset, which means that it can also be unlearned. Let's go back to our genderbread person and expand on expression. I've added to the side gender roles, gender expectations, and parental dreams, all of those things that happen to us. We remember times when our mother told us not to fold our arms over our chest, but to stand erect, and we're trying to hide our developing breasts because we feel a little ashamed of those. Or our fathers chiding us to not cry when we've banged our thumb with a hammer because men don't cry. Happens all the time. Some of the more indirect ones are parental dreams. How often have you stood at the window looking in at the newborn nursery and watched people dream about their daughter's wedding or their sons heading off to medical school? Gender expression is a very powerful thing. Gender roles are a part of gender expression. So, girls are socialized to conform to female gender roles. Boys are socialized to conform to the male gender roles. And we could put those together if we had time. If this was a full day seminar, we would be on the board describing how we learned the gender roles, where they came from, and what they taught us. But for now, we're not going to do that. While society determines what the gender roles are, and by society, that's one little word that can unpack into a lot of ways. It includes Madison Avenue, it includes television, it includes movies, it includes peer pressure. However, the real enforcer of gender roles are families and schools. Note, this is a shameless promo for my July 11th presentation, Trans in the Family. If you have time, go to http://www.kirkridge.com to sign up. I did not ask permission for that, but I might have to get forgiveness. Okay. It means the differences between the way men and women walk, talk, comport themselves, and socialize are not innate, but are culturally determined and therefore learned. It's not natural that women are thought of as interested in homemaking, the arts, and fashion. It's learned. It's equally not natural that men are thought of as interested in outdoors, hunting and fishing, cars and sports. It's learned. I have a story about all of this. There came a time in my gender transition 25 years ago. It's hard to believe that it's been that long. I'm a psychotherapist by training, licensing, and profession. So my living has always been earned in a counseling office. And for the longest time, I worked in a group on Peachtree Street right here in Atlanta. And that's where I began my transition. But the day came when I needed to leave that place so that I can open a new office in my new gender identity, So I moved to an office building down Peachtree Street. I wanted to keep the address. I liked it too well. But I moved to a new building and set up my new office there. It was very different than my old building. The new one had a big open lobby, and the elevator came up from the parking garage in the basement to the lobby at one side of the lobby, and the elevator to the tower where my office was all the way on the other side of the lobby. So I began, for the very first time, to have to walk in a crowded lobby on a slippery, shiny marble floor from, I guess it was granite, from one side of the room to the other. It was daunting. But I started making it without too much difficulty, but it wasn't long before I started realizing that I was crashing in to other people. In fact, I was crashing into men, exclusively men. This troubled me. I didn't know why it was happening. I tried for a while to concentrate on walking so that I would avoid them, and it didn't work. I kept crashing into them. I went to my therapist. I said, Sally, you know, what's wrong with me? I keep bumping into men. I crash into them in the, you know, outside the building, in the lobby. Anytime I'm walking in public, it just seems like I'm a walking disaster. And she said, well, you know, you might start to think about whether or not you are attracted to men. And I, you know, something that we'd talked about a lot before. I said, oh, no, it couldn't possibly be. After a while, the topic sort of got tabled and it went away, and we didn't talk about it before. But that I brought it up troubled me deeply, because I had been a feminist since feminism was a word, and the idea that in order to be the woman that I wanted to be in the world, that I would have to train myself to start avoiding men, because what I discovered in my observation was that men and women walk differently in public spaces. Men tend to walk in a straight line, not a straight line like rulers, but a straight line like from where they are to where they're going. They go in the most direct route possible. Women, on the other hand, have a tendency to add curves to the route. And, you know, it goes by the newsstand to check the headlines of the newspaper, or by the jewelry store, or across to say hi to their friend. But the most important thing that it does is it gives the right of way to the men, because women always organized their walking to make sure that men didn't bump into them, because the men were going to go straight no matter what. I couldn't fathom myself doing this. It made me feel kind of ill inside. And so I put the whole subject aside and decided not to think about it. It was several months later, when I was reading in my journal about what I had, about this story, and I realized as I reflected on it that I wasn't crashing into men anymore. And I thought further and realized that somehow, without even thinking about it, I had been trained to walk in public like every other woman. Now, that's one tiny part of gender expression, one little minuscule thing. Think about all the dimensions of gender expression that exist in a person's life, and how powerful our social pressure is to mold us into how we behave. So we're going to summarize. Biological sex is not really binary. That is either or, male or female. Sexual orientation, in other words, LGB, is not equivalent to transgender, T. One is about who I am attracted to, and the other is about who I am. Gender or gender identity is the internally held sense of who I am, and may be masculine, feminine, both, neither, or other. Gender expression is the way we express gender and may or may not be in line with our gender identity. Gender roles are the product of culture. Here we are. This is the last section of our presentation, so you can begin to relax. Oh no, you can't relax. This is terrible. What I did is I put the genderbread person out there in the center with all the stuff that we put on them. And there they are, just sort of filled with gender, orientation, sex, and expression, and all those things on this continua. And then I added all the other pressures that impinge on a person in life. And of course, I didn't put all of them. I just put what I could think of at the time. I left some blanks in there, hoping that maybe we would have time to get to fill those in together as a group. But we're not going to do that. And so what you can do is imagine all the other things that go on those other lines. In my family, disability would be in there because I have a child who has a disability. Notice that faith is the biggest one. In my work with transgender people over the last 25 years, I have discovered that whether or not a person is a church person or a religious person, that faith is probably one of the biggest components that impinges on how a person deals with the whole of their being. And that's very important. We're going to talk a little bit about intersectionality because that's kind of a more formal way to talk about those pressures in a more systematic way. You probably have heard the word these days. It's getting to be kind of popular, almost trite, but not quite. Intersectionality is the interconnection nature of social categorizations, such as race, class, and gender, as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. So when we talk about intersectionality, we're talking about oppression. We're talking about how people, the sources of oppression in the life of groups of people and individual people. And it's through an awareness of the intersectionalities that impinge on people's lives that we learn how to be better citizens and better neighbors. Just to give you a current example, one that comes right straight out of today and this morning and this afternoon and tomorrow and probably the days ahead. We have Black Lives Matter. So we're talking about a person who is Black and deals with as the oppression that we know of in our society that is immense and dates for at least 401 years just because they happen to be a Black person. But then we have another Black person who happens to be Black and trans. And we have someone who lives at an intersection between race and gender expression. Transgender is another oppressive category. And if you don't believe it, pay attention to what comes out of the White House these days related to transgender people. And here we have a person who now has two oppressions intersecting in their life at the same time. And sometimes they are additive to each other, sometimes they're not, sometimes they conflict with each other. And we could even go down even further and talk about Black trans women's lives. And there we're adding sex to the mix, and Black trans women, another oppressed category. And we have someone who has 3 intersections in their life. Actually, they're 6 because they go both sides of the person, but we'll talk about them as 3. And of course, the very last one I've added, Zoe Spears' life matters. And I put that in there because Zoe Spears is a person. She isn't just a name. Zoe was killed on June 13th, 2019, just over a year ago. That is her picture. A delightful, beautiful young woman. She was 23. She lived in DC. And she was shot on the same street as another trans woman who was shot just 2 months before her. Her friends describe her as having been a vibrant and high-spirited young woman. She has a mother and father who are mourning her loss, as well as a community in her home in the District of Columbia. That's what happens when Black and trans and woman go together. Do you know what the average life expectancy for a Black transgender woman is in the United States? I was going to ask everybody to put it, to just take a guess and put it on the, go ahead and do that. Take a second, go to the chat, just open a chat to everyone and just type in a number. Just type in, what you think that might be. Go ahead, take a sec. What is the average life expectancy for a Black transgender woman? Of course, you already know an example. She only lived until the age of 23. But we're talking about all Black transgender women. The answer is 35. 35 years old. That's the time when children are growing up and reaching teenage years, and they're starting to think about college and family and their own lives. It's the time when young men are experiencing the accelerated growth of their jobs, and when young women are deciding perhaps to go back to school and earn a degree, become a professional, a doctor or a nurse, or open their own business. It is a rich and full time of life. And it's when most Black transgender women find their end. This is the Black Trans Lives Matter rally 1 week ago today in New York City. Look at those faces. And I'm sure that they are both trans and cis. There are Black and white, there are young and old, there are men and women. It is, to me, this picture brings tears to my eyes when I see all of the people who came together. They couldn't all possibly be transgender, but I'm sure many of them are. There were 15,000 of them in New York City marching for Black trans lives. This is what intersectionality looks like in a graph. I think I prefer real life. If you're Black and transgender, the chances are 4 out of 10 that you're homeless or have been at some point in your life. There's a 1 in 4 chance that you're unemployed. These numbers came before the COVID crisis, so there's no doubt that they are much, much higher today. Poverty, 34% with household incomes less than $10,000. The whole community of trans people has a rate that is half that, only 17%. Still pretty high. HIV status, 20.23%. The trans overall rate is 2.6%. That's why it is imperative that we all support our HIV nonprofit agencies in the work that they are doing. Half of Black transgender human beings have attempted suicide. The upside is their families are more supportive than other trans people. I've experienced that in my practice. Black trans, especially Black trans women, have families that are behind them 100%, and that tends to be the rule. The other group are Vietnamese families, interestingly enough. This is a picture that my friend Michael Adey put on Facebook this week to send to his friends. I think it's one that he took from Santa Fe, where he lives. Michael's here on the line, of course, with us. I thanked Michael for it. I got it, and I was moved by it. And the first thing that came into my mind after my emotions sort of spilled over because of its beauty was to think whether it was sunrise or sunset. I didn't know. I thought about asking Michael, and I decided no, I didn't really want to know. I looked at the low-lying clouds and what looked like fog off in the distance and thought, well, maybe it's sunrise. And then I looked at the red sky and thought, well, maybe it's more sunset. Sunrise or sunset, I thought this was an appropriate way to end this presentation because it's where we are.